Today's topic is the prepositional phrase. We call this PP. Now, this is actually the only kind of phrase that we've got left. And we'll look at some of the syntactic and semantic features of these prepositional phrases. Now, according to your textbook, prepositions have in common that they express some sort of relation between the prepositional complement and the constituents appearing before it. And some of the things that they can specify is a position in relation to one another, right? That something is on something or something is behind another thing. We can also use prepositions to indicate direction when you say from or past or through. We can also use prepositions to indicate time or duration, courses, and we can see here that we have what's called complex prepositions that consist of basically more than one word. We can also use prepositions to indicate a purpose or an instrument, right? So by means of, for instance. Now, these are of course only some of the literal senses of prepositions, and many prepositions may also be used metaphorically, and thus the same preposition may cover many possible meanings. So it is possible to describe the relation further in more general terms. So it's generally held that a prepositional phrase expresses what is called a figure-ground relation or figure-ground alignment, which is the relation between two entities in which one, which we call the ground, is considered to have background-like qualities, and the other, which we call the figure, is considered to be in the foreground of the ground. Now, the relation between them is sometimes called the path, but it seems perhaps more logical to call it the relation. Now, the figure-ground relation seems to be the underlying semantic relation of the prepositional phrase, which, as you may remember from your textbook, looks like this. So we have a preposition first, right? That's the P, that's the actual prepositional word. And then we have the prepositional complement, so this could usually be a noun, right? So on the table, on is the preposition and the table is the prepositional complement. So what the underlying figure-ground relation does is that it links up the prepositional phrase structure and the constituents before it like this. So we have obviously the P, the relation, right, on in this case, and the PC, which is the ground, so that could be the table, on the table, and then we have whatever comes before it, which is the figure. So we could say the book on the table, right? In this case, the book is the figure, and then we have on, which is the relation, so it specifies a position, and then finally we have the table, which is the ground. So this is a general sort of schematic relation, and it specifies the specifics, of the relation depends on the preposition. Okay, so is it on or in or through, right? And then also the prepositional complement, obviously, right? What is the ground? Is it a table? Okay, is it a road? Is it a building? Is it some sort of temporal aspect? Now, the reason why it's difficult or challenging is that some prepositions have several meanings, and often exactly which meaning applies depends on just what is captured in the prepositional complement. So we'll look at some examples here. You can see that the word on, this preposition, is in all of these 5 sentences, right? We have a ninja on the floor, a ninja on the wall, a ninja on my mind, on the train, and on drugs. So we can see that if we say a ninja is on the floor, this refers to a position and probably a horizontal position, right? So the ninja is probably lying down on the floor. If I say a ninja on the wall, this becomes a vertical position, all right? So the ninja is upright somehow, sort of crawling on the wall, maybe. Obviously, a ninja on the train has to do with location, possibly. It's aboard a vehicle, it's inside the train, right? Maybe it's on top of the train, we don't know. And obviously, finally, a ninja on drugs. This is a metaphorical use, obviously, right? So it's not a literal meaning of the preposition. And as if that isn't enough, the nature of the elements appearing before the prepositions, all right? So the figure in this case, they also play a role in specifying the meaning of the prepositions and thus in specifying the relation itself. So again, here we have on the ninja. Yeah, but here we have the piano landed on the ninja. The uniform looks good on the ninja. So we can see we have all of these on the ninja. But because of the figure, because of what comes before the preposition, we can see that the preposition itself takes on slightly different meaning in all of these four sentences. So this polysemy of prepositions is one of the reasons why so many foreign learners of English have problems finding the right preposition, right? Another reason is also that prepositions in most languages are polysemous, so they do have several different meanings, but they often do not overlap cross-linguistically in terms of which meanings they cover. So on in English and på in Danish, we can use, in both English and Danish, we can use the prepositions in lots of different ways to mean different things, but there might not be a complete overlap. So every time you have on, you probably don't have to use på in all of those same instances, right? Sometimes you'll have to choose another one. In English, prepositional phrases may realize the following syntactic functions. We first of all find prepositions on the primary level, and we can see here that in sentence 1, the ninja jumped onto the bus. It has the function of an adverbial, right? Whereas in the next one, they are in high spirits. Because it follows main verb be, right, in the they are, you could classify it most likely as a subject complement. However, if you want to argue that it's an adverbial, that's fine as well. Finally, we can also find prepositions and prepositional phrases as an object complement, as in, I regard him as my best friend. However, you may want to argue that this is actually an adverbial, but it makes sense that they occupy these syntactic functions on the primary level. Obviously, we can also find prepositional phrases at the non-primary level. So remember, this is when we sort of dig into the sentence and we find them in these modifier positions. First, we have a post modifier in a noun phrase. So the explosions on the battlefield could be heard miles away. So we have the explosions. So explosion here, right, is the head of the noun phrase. We have the, which is the determiner, and then we have a post modifier on the battlefield, and that's the post modifier then in the noun phrase, and it's a prepositional phrase. We can also find prepositional phrases as post modifiers in adjective phrases or post modifiers in adverbial phrases. Now, you should note that in relative subclauses and in interrogative clauses, the preposition phrase is often discontinuous. And this is because the prepositional complement, being a relative or interrogative pronoun, has been moved to the front or perhaps even elided altogether, then that means deleted. And this often happens in relative clauses. Let's look at some examples. Here in A, we have the woman that or who I saw you with the other day wasn't your wife. So here we can see that I saw you with a woman, all right? So this a woman has been replaced by the WH word here, all right? And because it's a relative clause, we then move that out. Okay, we have to move it out because this relative pronoun has to be at the beginning of the clause. A similar thing is in what are you referring to? Because it's an interrogative clause, so whatever it is we don't know in this, you are referring to something, this something is what we don't know. So that is captured by the WH element here, what, and that has then been moved to the front. So what we need to see is that the prepositional phrase, okay, has been sort of divided into two. So it's discontinuous. Normally we would have the preposition with, for instance, followed immediately by the prepositional complement. However, in some of these cases, we have to split them up, and that's because of syntactic reasons. Now, it is possible to move the whole prepositional phrase to the front, and this is often done in formal English texts. So A1 here, the woman with whom I saw you the other day, it should say, wasn't your wife. So that's perfectly possible. You can put with whom to the front. Similarly here in B1, right, you can actually say to what are you referring. It is slightly more formal in tone, but both of these are absolutely correct. Now we'll look further at some of these prototypical sort of specific figure-ground relations, okay, or the literal meanings expressed by some central prepositions, and this hopefully should also help you figure out which ones to use when you write or speak in English. Now we can use prepositions that capture some sort of stillness. Okay, so for instance the preposition at we can use to denote either a point in space or a point in time. Okay, so at 5 o'clock, on a scale or something like that. We can use the preposition in to indicate an enclosure or containment, also in either space or time. And finally, on normally indicates a position on a surface. And we can see that here there is some sort of stillness, all right? It captures that something is placed at a particular place, all right, in a certain situation, but it's stillness. Another way of looking at these prepositions that express a figure-ground relation are to look at movements. So some of the prepositions actually express that there is movement involved such that the figure moves along a path relative to the ground. Okay, so for instance, by using the preposition into, we're indicating that there is some sort of movement into an enclosure. Yeah? Or out. That indicates that there is a movement out of an enclosure through an opening. Okay, so aperture here means opening. We can also use out of, actually, again to indicate a movement out of some sort of enclosed space. And then finally through, obviously a sort of movement through a three-dimensional entity of some sort. Now some prepositions again actually have more grammatical or possibly less tangible functions, so they can become quite abstract. So for instance the preposition of. Now often we'll use this following units of measure or partitives, okay, so a loaf of bread for instance, and other quantifying expressions. We often find it in geographical terms or calendrical terms, so things to do with time. Okay, so the 1st of January, for instance. We find it after what's called category nouns in constructions like kind of, type of, a sort of, yeah. And obviously we can use it with other terms, as in the Battle of Waterloo, yeah. The similar thing with by, we use that to express agency in passive constructions, which you are experts on now, and also to indicate, for instance, an instrument. Now, syntactically speaking, we know that prepositions are followed by a prepositional complement. And if the prepositional complement is a pronoun, this has to be in the object case. Okay, so it is on the table. You can say she fell on the table, but if you say she fell on him, then him is in the object case, and we can see that because it's him and not he, for instance, which is the subject case. Furthermore, we also know that prepositions cannot be followed by a that clause. All right, so you can't say on that or on from that or something, and it cannot be followed by an infinitive. Okay, so you can't say on to go or something like that. Okay, so these are simple rules that you can note down and try to remember. Now, with regard to morphology, we know that prepositions take no inflections. Okay, so you can't add little bits to them. They are basically the way they are. And we have two types of prepositions. We have the ones that are one word or simple prepositions. They exist, or rather they consist of just one word, for, on, in, from. And then we have the complex prepositions or multi-word prepositions that consist of more than one. Now, why is it that prepositions are so hard? Well, for one thing, they look just like words from other word classes. Okay, so they're sneaky. They can look a bit like an adverb. So after, before, down, and since. They're actually both prepositions, but they're also adverbs. Again, one thing to keep in mind here is that a prepositional phrase or a preposition always takes a complement, and this is usually a noun phrase. All right, so if you have one of these words and you're not sure, is it an adverb? Is it a preposition? If it's followed by a noun phrase complement, all right, it's going to be a preposition. They also look a bit like conjunctions. So again, here, after and before, they can also be conjunctions. But again, we know that the prepositions always take a complement, and we know that conjunctions are usually placed at the beginning of a clause. And you're very, very unlikely to find a preposition at the beginning of a clause. Also, the infinitive marker to looks a bit like, well, it looks exactly like the preposition to. But again, we know that the complement of a preposition is usually a noun phrase. It could be a verb, but then the verb will be in the ing form. However, the infinitive marker to cannot be followed by a noun, but it must be followed by a verb in the infinitive. Okay, so to eat or something like that. Now, because of their meaning, especially when used in idioms, these uses obviously language specific, and that's one of the reasons why it's so difficult. And the best way to get better is to learn the most frequent uses by heart, and especially those that are different from Danish, and then basically look up the rest. So check your prepositions when you need them, you know, in your grammar book, in a dictionary, but being aware of the fact that they are actually different from Danish is your first step. Finally, I just have a brief example, and this is from real life. So this was basically an email, and I received the email in English, but basically contained a mistake, and I think it's because the person who sent it to me, the student who sent it to me, probably thought they were thinking in Danish, right? So this is the sentence. Beklager det sene svar, men jeg har haft travlt på arbejde, og i dag er min eneste fridag, så er det muligt at mødes i dag. Okay, so this is quite a long, poorly constructed sentence, but the problem is obviously på arbejde, right? Here we have the preposition, yeah? And obviously, if you then have to translate it, it seems likely to go på. Oh, that's probably on, right? That's the most likely one. But if you do that, okay, I've been busy on work, it obviously turns out wrong. So this is an incorrect constructed, right? It's an incorrect sentence in English, and this was indeed what I received. However, you should obviously go with at work, right? I've been busy at work. So that would be the correct solution to that one.